Yippee, yippee, yay, yippee, yay, we're strong and sturdy, fed the pet milk way.
Invented by Gail Borden in 1856, canned condensed milk became a staple in American war rations hereafter. The development of canned goods was a turning point because it provided a nutritional, long-lasting food preservation method that allowed American soldiers to thrive throughout future conflicts such as the Civil War. Now, to understand how we got from tough cans of condensed milk to the easy-opened canned bread we have today, we have to start in 1795. Napoleon had just been made aware of how the salted meats and hardtack were taking a toll on his men's health, and set a reward of 12,000 francs, or nearly 40,000 modern-day dollars, to anyone who could find a longer-lasting and more nutritious alternative. A brilliant chef, confectioner, and scientist named Nicolas Appert had discovered a technique to keep food safe from spoiling 15 years after the initial request. His new technique included the process of heat sealing a glass jar with cork, string, and wax in order to quote-unquote keep the decay out. Despite Appert not technically being correct on why his process worked, the important thing is that it did, and not only did it worked so well that it eventually developed into the most common commercially preserved food techniques in the world. The tin can, later patented and invented by Philip de Gerard and Peter Durant in 1811, was eventually popularized upon English Navy ships, and in 1812, the first cannery was opened. Word of this successful food preservation method eventually made its way to America in 1825, when canned fruits, vegetables, and oysters were patented by Thomas Kensett and Ezra Daggett for the people of New York. Although the duo found success, it was minimal, as the idea of eating a sort of magically preserved food out of a tough, opaque can wasn't very appealing to the masses. America had just recently started to move away from locally grown foods, so this was quite a large change many weren't willing to make. It didn't help that the technique used for canning at the time didn't have a solution for the smell it created. Similarly, in 1856, a man named Gail Borden, soon to be the founder of Borden Dairy, caught wind of this hot new invention from England and took a different approach. Instead of canning something people weren't as familiar with as oysters, Borden invented canned condensed milk. Although it wasn't an instant hit, it did start to gain some popularity due to its convenience and smell, or more specifically, its lack thereof. Borden's new product gained so much traction due to it being labeled as pure and unadulterated, which was enticing as there had been a recent scandal in New York in which malnourished cows led to thin, diluted milk. Although this wasn't a great development for the dairy industry, it was the leading factor in why Borden's condensed milk was such an instant hit. In 1861, the Civil War officially began. Many were sent to war, and due to such circumstances, canned condensed milk started to appear in many military bases, although many soldiers still relied on salted pork, hardtack, and dried produce. Sometimes the soldiers, especially those who were in higher ranking, would get access to beans, rice, coffee, and more importantly, canned goods. The Sanitary Commission, a private agency that treated Union soldiers, had been providing canned condensed milk as an ailment, calling it the sick soldier's nectar. This caused many soldiers to become familiar with the former alien concept of foods being preserved in a tough, opaque casing. This is where canned goods, especially non-milk-related canned goods, really started to gain attention, as there were also major strides in the canning industry. Once soldiers returned home, it was inevitable they would spread word of how this once strange device was inherently useful, even outside of the uses it served in wartime. The news of this new food preservation method seemed to grow extremely popular with the family of these soldiers, specifically American farm wives with military husbands, as they saw canning as a great tool that could stretch their summer and fall crops all throughout harsh winters and barren springs. On October 18, 1952, Allen Long said, N. Appert discovered the art of fixing the seasons. With him, spring, summer, and autumn exist in bottles. Later, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad saw its completion, allowing canned products to be shipped all around the country. And in the 1870s is when canned goods first started to appear in households, in the form of home canning. Due to the popularity of home canning, we start to see the rise of the home canning industry, and the advancement of research going to the safety of canning, as well as the growing popularity of other brands, such as Kerr Home Canning Company and John Landis Mason's Mason Jar. its wide reach into other industries already showing its promise for being a major turning point in our history. Although home canning was showing much success, the same promise was yet to be reflected in its sister, commercial canning. Although consumers were now more familiar with the product, that did not mean they were comfortable with it, as many people were only open to the idea of home canning because of familiarity, not because of safety. The United States Department of Agriculture was only stated recently on May 15, 1862, so there weren't many safety measures in place, and they released their first complete guide to home canning more than 100 years after. In 1870, there were less than 100 canneries in the world, for many reasons, including how tin cans were still formed by hand, they would usually employ farm women and children, and only pack and sell local produce. But by the time we hit the 1900s, we find almost 18,000 canning companies. The what seems sudden rise of canning companies was due to the release of many new advancements in technology, such as the release of the pressure canner in 1874, and the mass manufacturing of glass jars from corporations such as the Ball Corporation. The reason it still took around 30 years for the canning industry to really begin to thrive was partly due to not everyone having access to all this fancy new equipment. But when those who did still wouldn't trust or use said machinery due to its questionable safety. But eventually, at the end of the 19th century, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology invested in studies to improve the taste, nutrition, quality, and most importantly, safety of canning. Due to these advancements, we start to see many canneries appear, especially in Baltimore, Maryland, where there was optimal soil, climate, as well as many fertile oyster beds. As we hit the end of the 19th century and head into the 20th century, we already see some big changes in the canning industry. Commercially canned foods began to become more common in markets, become sold in bulk, and most interestingly, begin to start containing more chemical additives. And it's an interesting development, as it is also around the time that health was a very emphasized matter. Although, it does make sense, as this is also the time when World War I began. World War I provided the perfect opportunity for canned goods to thrive. During the war, the women who weren't serving were heavily encouraged by the US government to take up home canning. There were several instances where the US government promoted home canning. The home canning initiative also branched from the promotion of war gardens, which were exactly what they sounded like, a patriotic contribution to the war effort via gardening. These efforts were later renamed to victory gardens after the war had been won. Canning was so supported by the government that communal canning centers were soon stationed everywhere in the US. These centers would often contain communal canning equipment that was free for anyone to use. This was also about the time we see the appearance of home demonstration agents. Who were these people who would go around to teach how to can at home safely? Home demonstration agents would often hold clubs at community canning centers for youth and young adults, which ended up being more safety meetings. Around this time is also when factory canned goods began to carry the same amount of nutritional value as the fresh produce they were derived from. World War II is where we really start to see the fall of canning. Near the beginning of World War II, aluminum began to become more rationed, leading to a halt of pressure canner production. Due to this, people became more likely to can at canning centers rather than at their own homes. Because of the rise of people using shared equipment, pressure canners began to commonly malfunction during use. It didn't help that the government's support also died down as there wasn't much need for food preservation. In 1945, just after World War II had ended, people wanted to return to what they thought of as normal. Seeing that canning became so popular due to it being built to perfectly suit the unstable economic state, the general public was inclined to go for the newer technology, like refrigeration. Although there was a small resurgence of popularity in the 70s, due to the DIY movement, canned goods never really saw the same light it did during the midst of war. Ever since its development, canning has been revolutionary, from being a stable food source during regressions to providing women an opportunity to participate in the war effort. Even today, we still see the widespread impact of the canning industry. The industry itself currently providing over 85,000 jobs. This shows how canning has solidified itself as a turning point in history.